Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very happy to be joined by Professor Chad Goldberg. He's a tenured sociology professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And Chad, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you, Mike. It's really a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation to come today.
Yeah, and full disclosure, Chad and I went to college together at an undisclosed time in the past. So
we go way back.
Been a little while, and congratulations to you on your career really since then, where the work you've been doing is certainly interesting, and that's really why we wanted to get you on the show today. The topic that really brought us together today is this notion of the Wisconsin idea, which we're going to get into as part of the show. And it's certainly relevant to a lot of the conversations that are happening today about the role of higher education, public higher education in particular. And there's a really interesting history to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and we're going to get into that with Chad. But typically the way I begin shows, Chad, is we like to get the origin story of our guest. In your own words, what got you to where you are today in your career and your intellectual life, and in particular here, what brought you to the course that you're teaching. And just to be clear, this course that says the Wisconsin idea, it's also publicly available, and a lot of the ideas that we're going to be talking about today, part of why I wanted to have Chad on the show is because they're very broadly applicable, and we can use this example in Wisconsin as something that we all, I think, can draw from. But Chad, just to start, can you share with us what got you here and why listeners to a show about trends in education, what might folks want to know about you?
Yeah, I have been at the University of Wisconsin for about 20 years now. And in a way, it's funny that I have become involved in this effort around the Wisconsin idea and renewing the Wisconsin idea because I'm not from Wisconsin originally. I did my graduate education in New York, and when I was doing my graduate education, of course, I knew about the University of Wisconsin. It's a famous institution, and the sociology department there has a very good reputation and has for a long time. But it's not someplace that I imagined that I would end up. And when I didn't know about the Wisconsin idea, it's something that I learned about here, and it's something that became important and valuable to me after I came to Wisconsin and after I learned about it and after I learned about the history.
Yeah. And just to round that out a little bit, within sociology, what drew you to sociology? What is relevant about sociology for folks today? One of the questions that we'll probably get into as well is the softer sciences, the social sciences, liberal arts. These are all areas that come up regularly on the show where folks are questioning what's the value of understanding those things, particularly as they relate to job placement and returning value to the economy, et cetera. Just to round out a little more your background and your history, what brought you to sociology and why do you think it's still relevant today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I became interested in sociology way back when you and I were in college together and started taking sociology classes there. And I was always interested in social and political affairs, and I think that's a part of what drew me to the discipline. I specialize in political sociology, study of politics and political life, but from a sociological perspective. And I would say that I was drawn to it for a couple of reasons. One, when I discovered sociology as an undergraduate, I had the feeling that sociologists, at least the sociologists that I was interested in and liked reading, were asking big and important questions about society and about social life, about the meaning of freedom, about equality and inequality, about the organization of work, about all these things, which I thought, wow, these are really interesting and important questions that are crying out for answers and concern all of us. Mm-hmm. And it's not that they always got the answers right or that they were always, that they had the answers complete. I still think there's questions. What's valuable to me are the questions and the ongoing discussion about how to answer those questions. And of course, the answers may need to change as times change and as mm-hmm. society changes too. So that was one reason. And the other reason, of course, is that I was sort of always interested in democratic politics and political participation and citizenship. And so that has manifested itself in different ways. When I was an undergrad, as you remember, I was involved in student government on campus. Later, I became involved in my union, and I'm interested in politics in the sense of how people come together to try to understand and resolve common problems, and how people can do that better, more effectively, and what are some of the problems, the obstacles, the barriers that prevent people from doing that sometimes.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then moving into this idea of the Wisconsin idea, and you also have a book coming out on this topic in the fall as well. What's the name of the book?
So the book is called Education for Democracy, Renewing the Wisconsin Idea. It's coming out in November from the University of Wisconsin Press. You can also find it on Amazon. It's available for pre-order. It's actually, I'm really excited about it. It's an edited volume. It's not just me. There are a number of contributors who have written essays for the book. And so it's interdisciplinary. There are contributors from a variety of different fields. Mm-hmm. And the book comes directly out of this public lecture series and course that we'll be talking about today. So it's almost all of the chapters, the essays in the book are based on lectures that were given at some point in the course and in the public lecture series.
Right. And the public lecture series began in 2016. You were the first instructor of record for the lecture series back then. And now this is a return engagement for you. So this is the second time. It's been running since 2016 each fall. And now you're back for another run through. And we're going to want to get into that as well, just to understand how things have changed, how the course has changed, and how 2020 being the crazy year that it is, how the whole notion of the Wisconsin idea and the curriculum you've designed in support of this course has evolved in line with the time. So we'll definitely want to pick up with that a little bit downstream. But before we do that, for folks who aren't familiar, and full disclosure, again, I wasn't familiar with the Wisconsin idea until we caught up maybe a few weeks back as we were talking about what we might do for a show. It's a pretty interesting notion, and I think it has a lot of relevance in this day and age. So can you summarize for our listeners what the Wisconsin idea is, and then maybe some ideas around how it's particularly relevant to the times that we're living in today?
Sure, yeah. And really, as I said, I didn't really know anything about the Wisconsin idea until I came to Wisconsin, and I didn't learn about it right away. It was something I heard about. It's, in Madison on campus at the university, people still talk about it a lot. But if you're not from there, you wouldn't necessarily know about it. It's a bit of an irony because 110 years ago, it was nationally celebrated. There was a book that University of Wisconsin graduate and civil servant, a guy named Charles McCarthy, wrote that came out, was published in 1912, called The Wisconsin Idea, which explained it for the whole country. And Teddy Roosevelt wrote the preface and introduction to the book, praising what was going on in Wisconsin. He was very excited about what was happening in Wisconsin, and urging Americans all over the country to pay attention to what was happening in Wisconsin and try to learn from what was happening in Wisconsin. But it is a kind of, it's an idea that has a long history. It goes back at least to the early 20th century, and some people have traced it back even further to one of the early presidents of the university toward the end of the 19th century. But I would say at its most basic, it is an idea that is focused on the public service role of the university, and emphasizes this very strongly, that the University of Wisconsin as a public university, its a reason for existence, its primary reason for being, the reason why it gets public support is because of the many ways that it serves the public or tries to serve the public. And I would add to that, one of the things that I think arguably distinguishes the Wisconsin idea from other public service missions, because you see this sort of thing a lot with land grants or public universities. Many of them imagine or conceive of public service as a very important part of what they do. So Wisconsin is not unique in that way, but maybe one thing that distinguishes Wisconsin and the Wisconsin idea, and something that I argue in this book that you mentioned, I think in Wisconsin, the notion of public service always had this democratic emphasis, this democratic conception, and that's why the book is called Education for Democracy. The idea was that the university was not just serving the public, as important as that is, but as the historian Frederick Jackson Turner put it, it was serving democracy. And so one interesting and important question is, how does a university serve democracy? What does that mean? And how can that best be done?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I think that is particularly relevant these days, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, is that in light of many of the challenges we're facing as a nation, and in light of many of the challenges that universities are facing, whether it's the response to the pandemic, or whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, or the hyper partisan nature of our public discourse is that folks are questioning in more fundamental ways the role of higher education and also the role of public higher education. And I thought that in particular made the Wisconsin idea something worth getting out there to our listeners. Can you talk a bit about why you think it's relevant? It was relevant enough in 2016 to begin this course with your colleagues, and why in some ways perhaps it's even more relevant to this day. What are some of the alternative notions around what higher ed or public university should be, and then how is this renewing this idea important in these times?
Yeah, great questions. So I think those kinds of issues about the role of the university and about how higher education, public higher education should develop and to what extent and how it should be supported, those were the impetus for the public lecture series and the course and ultimately the book. In 2015, the person who was then governor of the state of Wisconsin, at that time it was Scott Walker, as some people might remember, this made national news. It was in national headlines. Governor Walker actually tried to rewrite the mission statement of the University of Wisconsin system. He didn't like the old mission statement. And what he tried to do was take out all the sort of flowery language about the pursuit of truth and improving the human condition and these sort of lofty ideals that were in the old mission statement. And he thought that it would be better if the mission was more narrowly focused on workforce development and training students for jobs and forget all this other stuff. There was a big uproar about it, and Governor Walker claimed that it was an accident, a drafting error, he said. We later found out from the press and from investigative journalists that it wasn't an error, it was very intentional. But it alarmed a lot of people at the university because we thought, it's not that we're against preparing students for jobs. I would say that, just speaking for myself, in my view, of course, that's an important aspect of what a public university should do. I know that a lot of my students, this is important to them, especially when the economy is not doing well. They have concerns about, am I going to get a good job when I get my degree, when I get out of college? So it's not that that's bad in itself. I think what a lot of us were concerned about was that the role of the university would be narrowed to only that. And so it would preclude all the other ways that historically the university has tried to serve the public and serve democracy. And at the very least, we thought if that's the direction that we're going to go in Wisconsin and other states as well, we should at least have a vigorous public discussion about this. Is this really the direction we want to go in? What are the alternatives? Is there another vision, another conception of the university's role that is worth defending? And we found that we weren't really having that public discussion, that these changes were being pushed through without it. And so part of the impetus for the public lecture series and the course was to try to spur that discussion and really raise those issues in a way that they wouldn't just be decided by politicians or university administrators, but would really be a subject of debate and conversation among all the people of the state.
Yeah, and in some ways that's true to your origin story as well, where these questions may not have answers, but having that discussion, and in this case in particular, a public discussion, not just something that is insular to the academic community. This course is both for credit for Wisconsin students, but it's also something that is publicly available, and that is something that we will share out as part of this podcast too. If folks want to hop in and they want to understand what's happening through this conversation, it's designed to be a public engagement around these topics.
Absolutely, yeah. And anybody in the world can actually go to our website, and it's easy to remember. It's www.wiscidea.com, WISCIDEA.com. It'll take you to the website for the course and the public lecture series. What you will find there are recordings of all of the public lectures that have been given since 2016. We're continuing to add recordings this fall for this fall's lectures. And other information about the course in the public lecture series. And of course, the lectures themselves, this fall, we're doing something different because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We used to do the lectures in person. We would have a big lecture hall in Madison, anybody could come. But of course, if you're not in Madison, it's not easy to get to a lecture. This fall, all of the lectures are online. So actually anybody anywhere in the world can participate. It's easy to get the information to join the lecture. They just have to contact me, and we welcome everybody's participation. We think that these are issues that go far beyond the borders of the state of Wisconsin, as I think you pointed to and you suggested. These are issues that certainly all the states and the United States are facing. We've had these discussions and debates about public education coming up in places other than Wisconsin. There's similar kinds of questions, similar kinds of debates. And I think also in other countries. Other countries are also experiencing now some disagreements and debates about public education, higher education there as well.
Yeah, and it is really interesting. I will want to get your thoughts on how this year is different beyond just the fact that the class is online, but the fact that these higher education can now be online does change the game in terms of opening up access. It's something that's been talked about since the advent of the massive open online courses in 2012. There's this sort of notion that anyone can get access to a great education, but the actual delivery of that has faced challenges, and we haven't really seen it fully blossom. In some ways, this year may be an inflection point there, and I'd love to get your perspective on that. I know we're still early into the course, but do you have any thoughts on how opening up this to online access maybe changes the conception of the course and changes how the conversation may evolve?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm of two minds about MOOCs. On the one hand, I see a lot of potential there for public outreach and for really improving and widening access to higher education and to these kinds of discussions that people wouldn't otherwise easily be able to join. So there's a lot of positive aspects about them, but there's also some concerning things about the way that they have been implemented. Yep. I'm concerned about, for one thing, as somebody who works in higher education, that they can be used in a way that basically concentrates teaching in the hands of some very highly paid, highly remunerated people at elite institutions, and then the instructional staff, faculty, and academic staff at other institutions. There's then a kind of pressure to make those jobs less well paying, less secure. So I don't think that's inherent in MOOCs and the technology, but I am concerned that they end up getting used that way. And then of course that's bad for higher education, I think, in the long run.
Yeah. And then the related point, I think, is the massive aspect of it, where the alternative, I don't know if you've heard of SPOCs, but small private online courses, which also live long and prosper, SPOCs. But it is a counterpoint, which is emerging. I've heard several of my guests have been talking about it in earnest more of late, that the forcing function of COVID moving pretty much all of education online has opened up the opportunity to have enough teaching talent to be able to apply to the problem so that you can actually have a more intimate, engaged conversation that's more akin to what you might get in a seminar or a smaller lecture series. And it sounds like what you're delivering here is probably more akin to that, where rather than being about the massive part, those who can attend live, in some ways you want to get those diverse perspectives and to drive the engagement. So more to come on that. But in addition
just to jump in there, just to add, because I think that's important. So you're absolutely right about that. And with our public lecture series and course, we've tried to do it both ways. We tried to eat our cake and have it too. So the public lecture part, I mean, that is potentially very massive. And so many people could tune into the lectures. There is an opportunity for people to ask questions at the end of the lecture, but it's not that small interactive setting that you're describing. So from the very beginning, we always paired up those public lectures with a kind of smaller discussion-oriented seminar meetings for undergraduate students who enrolled at the university who wanted that kind of experience. And so we tried to have it both ways. Somebody like you who went to a liberal arts college, I think that kind of experience is really valuable and really important. We didn't want to lose that. And so that's how we're trying to do it. And I also wanted to add that it's important for another reason. One other concern I have with the massiveness of MOOCs is I actually think that there's real value in having a plurality of different people teaching subjects in different ways. That we're not, so you could say, well, Chad Goldberg is doing this Wisconsin Idea course. Nobody else needs to teach this. They could all just tune into the lectures, but that would really be a loss, because other people would teach it in different ways with different emphases. And that's part of the reason why, from the very beginning, we didn't want the same instructor every year. So up until this year, it's been a different instructor each year. And so our idea was to have a kind of at least a pool of faculty who would take turns doing it and do it in different ways. And I would even see value in different institutions doing it in different ways. So the way that we do it in Madison maybe is not the way that they would do it at other University of Wisconsin campuses, and in Stevens Point or in Green Bay or someplace else. Yeah, so I think there's real value in having a plurality of different approaches and methods. So on.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of a lot of the research we've talked about on this show around diversity, and getting diverse perspectives to any group process is generally going to make it more effective. So rather than saying, it's almost like the Khan Academy, which is really interesting in a lot of ways. When it was really exclusively Sal Khan was when I think it ran the risk of what you were describing, where it becomes really one person does it, and that's the only voice that we hear. And a lot of the research that we've seen really in organizational psychology and in a lot of group process is that you do want to be exposed to diversity of thought. And in some ways that is a challenge, getting back to the point I was making before around the divisiveness and the filter bubbles and echo chambers that many of us are living in these days. In some ways that runs counter to the notion of public discourse that I know is very foundational to the Wisconsin idea and to the way in which you and team have been delivering it. I would love to get some perspective from you on how the course and the delivery has evolved. The fact that you're in Wisconsin in 2016, which also was a presidential election year, and Wisconsin was a battleground state then. And now in 2020, we're recording this right towards the end of September. Things are really heating up in terms of the U.S. presidential election and the rancor there. In addition, there's you're not far from Kenosha, Wisconsin, where Jacob Blake happened, and everywhere in the world is facing the challenges of the pandemic and the social distancing and sheltering at home. So do you have any perspective as the course is getting underway for the second time? First, just in terms of the evolution of the course itself, but then secondly, in terms of the exigencies of 2020, how is that informing your thinking, and how is that informing how the course is progressing, at least so far?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts about that. As you say, Wisconsin wasn't always this way, but in the past 10 years, Wisconsin has become very polarized politically, very divided, and mirroring trends in the rest of the country, I think. It is odd because before 2010, Wisconsin didn't have that reputation. There were, of course, political differences. There were Democrats, Republicans, but I think there was just less divisiveness and less polarization, and a bit more bipartisanship to try to work out solutions to common problems. That was always historically more in the Wisconsin tradition. And when we developed the course in 2016, the course was being developed when the state was in the midst of a series of pitched battles around various, I would say, transformative policies that Wisconsin Republicans were pushing through the legislature. At that time, the party basically had control of all branches of government. It controlled the governor's office, both houses of the state legislature. There was a conservative majority in the state Supreme Court. They were really able to accomplish everything that they set out to accomplish, even things that sparked a lot of public opposition, including, if the listeners maybe recall this way back, one of the very first things that Scott Walker did as governor was to push through a pretty radical reform of labor law, and Wisconsin was a pioneer in granting collective bargaining rights to public sector employees, and legislation that Governor Walker and Wisconsin Republicans pushed through early in Walker's first term, really eviscerated those collective bargaining rights for public sector employees. And of course, that set a precedent for people in other states, for politicians, governors in other states who have also tried to do similar things. We were aware of this context, but we didn't want the course to be politicized. That was actually really important to me. And I was part of a group of people that was deeply involved in developing the course from the very beginning. And I felt very strongly about this. We didn't want the course to be partisan or politicized. We thought that actually would not be in the spirit of the Wisconsin idea. And so for that reason, for instance, I always opposed the idea of inviting politicians from either party to deliver the lectures. There were sometimes suggestions, why don't we get this political official or that political official to give a lecture.
Hmm.
And for the most part, we have avoided that
Hmm.
for precisely that reason. We didn't want to politicize it. But at the same time, we felt that there were important political conflicts and changes going on in the state and that they should be addressed in the public lectures. In that first year, we did have a number of lectures from people inside and outside of the university analyzing some of the changes that were going on politically in the state, the reasons
Yep.
for that, the likely consequences, and so on.
Hmm.
And I think that was the right way to do it. Now, coming back 4 years later, you're right that the political context is different once again. It's not that Wisconsin has become less polarized, probably more so. We have a divided government now. We have a Democratic governor, and the Republicans still control the legislature, and the conservatives still have a majority in the state Supreme Court. But other issues have risen to the fore. And when I and others were planning the lectures for this fall, we thought it seems to be the central issue is going to be the COVID-19 pandemic. So we included a lot of lectures about the Wisconsin idea and public health, or the role of the university and public health. As we were finalizing the lectures, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, it's not that it began then, of course, it had been going on for a long time, but really gained a lot of publicity. It really exploded in the streets. There were demonstrations. They were reaching more people were involved. There was a sense of outrage about George Floyd, and again, not to say that there was no outrage about previous killings, but somehow something seemed to have changed with the development of the movement. And then we started to scramble, thinking this is also hugely important.
Mm-hmm.
This is really at the top of many people's concerns. It's a hugely important public issue. So we tried to include a little bit what we could, as much as we could, this fall about that. We have a lecture that I'm very much looking forward to later in the semester about sort of inclusion in the Wisconsin idea, and this issue of who got left out of the early conceptions of the Wisconsin idea. To what extent have those groups been included? To what extent do we have more work to do to include those groups? And I think that's really important. I would like if we had been able to do more of that. The problem is that there's always a bit of a lag in terms of when you plan the lectures, and then sometimes current events overtake what you've planned. And that
Mm-hmm.
happened to us a little bit this fall.
Yeah, but it's still an evolving conversation, and it is a place where you are looking to engage a broader set of perspectives. And I think duly noted on the point about not making it overly politicized or partisan, because it does seem like that is consistent to the ideals originally espoused around this idea, and really some of the aspirations perhaps for renewing this notion. I do want to get some of your perspective on other trends that you might be tracking outside of what we discussed so far. But before we get there, I would like to get a little bit more perspective from you on the future of this idea. And it did sound like, because it is a public discourse, there is a chance that the renewal doesn't happen, and that we're a trend spotting show, but we're also trying to understand potential futures that we may move forward towards. So do you have any perspective on where public education may go, whether they're good, bad, weird, indifferent? I would be curious where you could see things heading, and also whether there are ways in which our listeners or individuals could become activated to try to move things in a positive direction.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts about that. I will answer the question, but I also just want to add quickly that in regard to the sort of avoiding making the public lecture series, of course, partisan or politicized, I should have also said that not only did we think that was a bad idea, but we actually can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
We can't do that because of state law and university policy that prevents university employees. We cannot use public resources, university resources, to advocate for a party or for a candidate or an official. And I think that those are good laws and policies. Those are a legacy of progressive reforms from decades ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I think those are good laws and policies.
Sure.
Yeah, in terms of the question that you asked, absolutely. The impetus for the public lecture series, the course, and the book, as I said, is we want to stimulate a discussion about public education, higher education, public universities, their role in a democratic society, what their role should be, and how and why the public should support the work that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And we felt that discussion wasn't happening, but you're absolutely right. We could have this discussion, we could have a vigorous public debate, and it could be that people like me who have a different view about what the role of the public university should be end up losing that debate. And people like Scott Walker maybe they're able to get the support of the majority of citizens. So it's certainly possible that we could lose that debate, but we should at least have the debate, and people should know what they're doing and what they're getting before we continue moving in that direction. I think that for a long time, there has been a movement to overhaul public universities and higher education in this country. I would, for lack of a better term, I would say that well-funded and powerful groups in the country that have been pushing what I would call a market model of the university, and that has different components. Part of it is what I would say is this overly narrow, exclusive focus on job training. Another aspect of that is taking a managerial approach to the internal governance of universities, putting aside traditions like in Wisconsin, we have a tradition, as other public universities do in other parts of the country, of university governance being shared among different stakeholder groups, faculty, students, and others. And the idea that those groups should have some influence, some say in how the university is governed. So moving away from that model, more top-down kind of managerial model of governance, that's part of what I would call this market model. Yeah. There was a documentary film that came out a few years ago that your listeners might know, a movie called Starving the Beast, which really did a very nice job of illuminating some of these trends, some of the groups behind them, and some of the ideas behind these trends, why some people think that these are good ideas and why they think that the university should move in that direction. But that, I think, is what people like me are up against. We have a different view, a different understanding, and I don't think we have the same level of resources or power, but I think what we can do, since we are educators, is to try to stimulate some public discussion and education around these issues.
Yeah, and reminiscent of, even if you don't necessarily control the legislature, if the people get the message and if they activate and take to the streets, as many folks are doing more broadly around Black Lives Matter and some of these other issues. Now the Supreme Court is up with the Ruth Bader Ginsburg seat. How much can the ideas get out there that then may activate some movements that will ultimately be another powerful component of our democracy and our public discourse? So with that, this is lofty too. I like the lofty conversation. Thank you for having lofty ideas that let me wax on this a little bit. But I always love to ask my guests, what other trends you're noticing that we haven't talked about so far? So we've been going deep on the Wisconsin idea, but are there other trends broadly around the world around us and education and the future that we haven't talked about that are capturing your imagination that you wanted to get out there for our listeners?
Yeah, I think in a funny sort of way, you could look at the efforts that I've been involved in, this public lecture series and course on the Wisconsin idea, this new book on renewing the Wisconsin idea, and you could say, Chad, this is backward looking, it's conservative looking, because you're looking back at this sort of storied past and all these great things that the university did in the early 20th century and into the mid 20th century. The book covers a lot of that, covers a lot of the ways that the university has tried to serve the public and serve democracy through the course of the 20th century. And you can say, look, times have changed. You want to go back to the past and we need to move forward. But I actually don't think that the book is conservative in quite that way. I do think that there are things of value that we can find in the past, and that there are things that remind us of the wide range and wide scope of ways that the university can serve the public and serve democracy. And that can inspire us. But I don't think anybody wants to say, oh, we could just go back to the way we did things in 1912. Nobody, right. I think, would say that. That's why the book is called Renewing the Wisconsin Idea, and not conserving or preserving the Wisconsin idea. Right. One of the conclusions that I've come to as a result of my involvement in these efforts is that as valuable as the past is as a source of inspiration, it would be a mistake to think that the Wisconsin idea is something static, that it was invented by some guys in 1812, and it's been the same ever since, and it's just a matter of clinging desperately to it and holding on to it. I think actually what we see when we take a historical look is that it has always been something that has developed and changed over time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's as it should be. It has to develop to adapt to new circumstances. And so for me, the question is, what are good ways of adapting, good ways of developing and changing, and what are ways that maybe we should be a little more skeptical of that distort the original meaning or the original inspiration for the Wisconsin idea, that basically use the slogan for things that are not very consistent with that early inspiration. But nevertheless, I do think it's an idea that needs to be renewed and not merely conserved. And I mentioned one other way that I think that's true, and this is something that is covered in some of our public lectures over the past few years and in the book. We should be forthright about acknowledging, as some scholars have pointed out, that 110 years ago, the people who developed the Wisconsin idea, they had a much more narrow view of who it was that they thought the university and the state government should be serving.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of groups, racial minorities, women, Native Americans. There are a lot of groups that were left out of that early vision of the Wisconsin idea.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've been thinking and talking about, and this obviously has a connection with Black Lives Matter, is to what extent has it become more expansive, more inclusive over time, and how can we make it more so in the future? How can we make sure that there aren't important groups, important voices that are getting left out of these lofty ideals and lofty aspirations about serving democracy and serving the public good?
Mm-hmm.
It's great, but if there are important groups that are getting left out of that defeats the purpose, right? So that's another way in which I'm interested and hopeful about new directions for the future. That one of the directions should be that we continue to work to make this a more inclusive idea.
Yeah, build a more perfect union and build a more perfect public university while you're at it is all very much in line with the Wisconsin idea and the work that you've been doing, Chad. Thanks very much for joining us, Chad. It was an amazing conversation. Really appreciate you coming, and I appreciate the work that you're doing.